Chapter 13. Corin forced himself to relax. Though Commander Antilles had cast the trip as an exercise in astronavigation and hyperspace jumping, deep down in his gut, Corin thought a lot was being left unsaid. He was certain that if they had been going out on a formal patrol or escort mission, Wedge would have told them so. The fact that he hadn't said anything conflicted with the mission requirement of packing up and stowing their personal gear in their X-Wings. This left Corin thinking something more than an exercise was taking place. Because of his training exercise scores, Corin had been promoted to lieutenant and given the command of 3 Flight. As an officer, he had expected Wedge would trust him enough to let him know what was really going on. Even so, with his background, he had great respect for security, and that put a brake on his uneasiness. Those concerns don't matter. Getting through the drill does. Heading outbound from Folor's scarred gray surface, Corin flew lead for Rogue Squadron's 3 Flight. Oral was back to starboard, while Lou Jane and Andorni were off to port, similarly staggered front and back. Within the unit, they had comm unit call signs of Rogue 9 through 12, respectively, though for this exercise they would be operating on a semi-independent flight. Let's keep it close, 3 Flight. Whistler will send you all our jump coordinates and speed parameters. Have your R2s double-check it, then lock the route. He checked his data screen for the positions of the first 2 X-Wing flights and Tycho Selchu bringing up the rear in a captured Lambda-class shuttle, Forbidden. We follow 1 flight on this leg, then 2 flight on the next one. After that, we're leading, so let's be prepared. The members of his flight signaled their readiness to jump, so Corin keyed his comlink over to the command frequency. 3 Flight ready to jump on your mark, Rogue One. Good. All flights, 5 seconds to mark. With Wedge's reply, Whistler began counting down for the 5 seconds. Corin watched the seconds click off the digital display. When it read 0, he engaged the X-Wing's hyperdrive and sat back as the stars filled the view screen. Just as the color threatened to overwhelm him with its intensity, his snub fighter leapt into hyperspace and moved beyond the ability of the light to abuse him. The first leg was to take them about an hour, and had them flying along the plane of the galactic dish, moving against the swirl of the galaxy itself. The course brought them in ever so slightly towards the core, which was good, because the databases containing information about navigation hazards got progressively better as they headed towards the core. And Coruscant. Corin knew the Imperial capital was not their intended target, at least not for this flight, but he felt certain that they would get there eventually. His more immediate concern, however, was plotting the course for the third leg of the jump. While he had not been told their final destination, Commander Antilles had given him a list of 20 starting and ending points, and he had calculated the best courses he could see for making those jumps. The direction, speed, and duration of the first leg allowed him to eliminate all but 2 of the courses given to Rosati for a solution for the second leg, and that narrowing down of ending points meant he only had 2 plans of his own to refine. The first course of his, which would take the flight further along the disk and outside the most populated and advanced section of the galaxy, had been plotted pretty tightly. Several black hole clusters narrowed leeway as far as that course was concerned. He glanced at it again and decided it couldn't be refined any more. Whistler, bring up the course for the Morobe system. The astromech droid hooted at him as numbers and graphics scrolled up on the screen. Yes, I know you did the best you could on this plotting. Freeze output there. He tapped the glass on the monitor. At the Corex system, you have a skirting by 0.25 parsecs. There's only 1 planetary mass in that system, and the sun isn't that big. Since the Corex system comes up so early in our leg, if you pull us another 1/10 of a parsec closer, we should come out of hyperspace close enough to Morobe's habitable planets that we won't need to make an in-system jump to find gravity if we need it. The astromech wailed at him. Corin laughed. You're correct. The data you used to compute the course indicated giving the system a wider berth, but that's because you're using merchant data, and they're afraid of pirates and smugglers working the system. We're a squadron of X-Wings. We have nothing to worry about. With astronavigation and hyperspace jumping being so tricky a business, courses were plotted as often as not to brush by inhabited systems, even if they were inhabited by social misfits and undesirables. If a hyperdrive went out mid-flight, or refused to engage after a course correction between jumps, being within hailing distance of worlds from which help could easily be summoned was a blessing. Trying to find a ship that had misjumped to some random location in the galaxy was next to impossible, as all those who hunted after the fabled Katana fleet had learned since its disappearance. The first leg of the journey ended uneventfully. Two Flight, with Rasadi the flying lead, took over from One Flight and brought the squadron around on its new heading. Just before they made the jump to lightspeed, Commander Antilles shot Corin the coordinates for the third jump. So, it's Morobe after all. Corin called the flight plan up one last time, ignoring Whistler's disgusted wail, and went over it. The course appeared as nearly perfect as possible, given the ships they were using. A ship capable of greater speed could have trimmed even more distance off the run by getting closer to the Corax system. The greater speed would allow it to resist the influence of the star's hyperspace mass shadow. Without the resistance, the ship would be dragged back into real space in the system and, more likely than not, would be unable to escape the sun's gravitational grasp. Fortunately, X-Wings have enough power to get us through. Corin glanced at his reactor fuel level readings. The hyperdrives barely sipped fuel, while the sublight engines gulped it. Running up to a lightspeed jump burned a lot of fuel, though not as much as maneuvering through a dogfight, but nothing they had done on their journey so far had been that taxing on the engines or fuel supply. By the time we make my jump, we'll still be at 87% of a full load, more than enough to make it to the Morobe system and back home again. The squadron came out of hyperspace, and Corin eased his stick to port. Squadron, come about to a heading of 230 degrees and depress 12 degrees. Flight plan on its way to you. He pushed his stick forward until the X-Wing's nose dipped slightly. Jump to lightspeed in 5. The jump to hyperspace for his legs seemed somehow smoother and more effortless than the previous two. He knew that sensation was an illusion, and he wondered about it for a moment or two. It occurred to him that the reason he was more at ease with his jump was because he had been in control of it. Mistakes made in calculating a hyperspace jump could be fatal, and Corin had never been good about putting responsibility for his life in another person's hands. But I don't have to worry about a mistake on this leg since I did the calculations. A keening whistle from his astromech made him smile. Fine, you did the calculations, with no help from me at all. Whistler's hooting became more urgent. The astromech started scrolling sensor data over the cockpit screen, but none of it made sense to Corin. There's another stellar mass in the Corax system. That's impossible unless... Before he could broadcast a warning to the other members of Rogue Squadron, the automatic safety cutout on the hyperdrive kicked in. The snub fighter burst through an incandescent white wall and into the outer reaches of the Corax system, and right into the middle of a running light fight. Corin threw the stick hard to port and pushed it forward. Rogue 11, break up stat! He trusted Oral would follow him, moving down and to the left, which cleared the way for the rest of the squadron to enter the system. Lock S-foils into attack position! He reached up and flipped the switch with his right hand. Whistler, have you ID'd those ships yet? The little droid shrieked urgently back at him. Anything you could give me! The big ship, Corin knew immediately, was an Imperial interdictor cruiser. Its quartet of gravity well projectors allowed it to create a hyperspace shadow roughly equivalent to that of a fair-sized star. The interdictors had proved effective in ambushing smugglers and pirates, and the presence of one of the 600-meter-long triangular cruisers in the Corax system was not wholly unexpected. It hadn't been there to trap them, however. Running from the cruiser, which Whistler identified as the Black Asp, was a modified Baudo-class star yacht. About 3 times as long as his X-Wing, the yacht had a broad triangular shape to it that was softened by the gentle down curve of its wings. It looked almost organic in origin, as if it should have been swimming through space instead of rocketing along on its twin engine's ion thrust. Corin had seen plenty of modified yachts in his time with Corellian security, and this one even looked vaguely familiar. Most often the yachts were modified to haul contraband. While he had no love for smugglers, he had even less for the Empire. Enemy of my enemy is my friend. Whistler bleated sharply. Corin glanced at his screen, then keyed his comm. Ties. Interceptors. Looks like a dozen of them. He looked up through his cockpit canopy and felt panic when he couldn't see with the naked eye what his instrument showed so plainly on his monitor. Rogue One, what are your orders? Wedge's voice came back cool. Engage them, but watch the cruiser's guns. I copy that. Rogue 10, on me. Oral double-clicked his comm, indicating understanding of Corin's order. That action seemed, like Commander Antilles' order, to betray no nervousness at all. The bitter taste slicking Corin's tongue surprised him because he'd flown against imps in real life in endless simulator battles. He'd never been this bad before. Nervous, yes, but not edging towards losing it. Pull yourself together, Corin. His hand snaked up and touched the coin he wore. Your squadron mates and the folks in that yacht are counting on you. Because the break they'd executed had taken them down, the interdictors and its ties were coming in above the line of sight. Pulling back on his stick, Corin thumbed a switch that put all power to the forward shield. All power to forward shield. Switching to proton torpedoes. A targeting box appeared on the heads-up display, and Corin maneuvered the X-Wing to drop the sight on the lead interceptor. The range indicator dropped numbers and digits as the X-Wing closed on the Imperial fighter. Easy. Easy. Let yourself go, just like in training. He nudged the flight stick to the left and framed the incoming squint perfectly. The box went red, and a strident beep filled the cockpit. Corin hit the trigger, and the first torpedo sped into its target. Another torpedo streaked past him and raced towards the uninterceptor. Both of the Imperial ships broke hard, but Oral's torpedo reduced his target to fire and scrap metal. Corin's missile missed his intended target, so he switched back to lasers and evened his shields out. Good shot, 10. Scratch one squint. Fingering the coin he wore beneath his flight suit, Corin swallowed hard, then keyed his comm unit. Cover me. I'm going after mine. Ratcheting the throttle up to full, Corin swooped the X-Wing up on its port stabilizers, then corkscrewed down through a roll that brought him out on the interceptor's tail. He linked his offside lasers so they fired two at a time and triggered a burst that burned armor from the interceptor's bent wings, but failed to destroy it. The squint drifted to the left, then came up in a roll that brought it around and over Corin's line of flight. If he continues that roll, I'll overshoot him and he'll end up on my tail. Corin pushed the stick to the left, making a wide turn to port that opened distance from the interceptor, but still let the Imperial ship slip in behind him. Oral cannot get him, 9. I know, 10. Not to worry. Keeping one eye on the rangefinder, Corin kept his X-Wing on the long loop. Come on, you know you want me. If you had proton torps, I'd be free space ions, but you don't. Yes, Whistler, I know what I'm doing. Feeling some of his confidence returning, he shrugged. At least I'm pretty sure I do. The interceptor pilot came up fast and flew in a straight line to get quickly to the same point in space where Corin could get slowly with his great loop. Seeing his prey close in fast, Corin centered and hauled back on his stick, tightening his turn considerably and jamming his body down in his seat. The X-Wing shot across the tie's line of flight barely 20 meters behind the ball and wing craft. Yanking the stick to starboard, Corin rolled the fighter 180 degrees. He pulled the stick back to his breastbone, bringing the X-Wing's nose up in another turn that reversed his previous course. Leveling the fighter out, he sailed in right on the tie's tail, his long S-turn having allowed him to let it overshoot him by a fair distance. A lethal distance. Corin lined the interceptor up in the sights and blew it apart with 2 laser blasts. As pieces of the disintegrating ship whirled past him, he keyed his comm unit. 10, report. Cover 10, heading 90 degrees. I have your wing, 10. Guiding the stick to the right, he saw Oral's X-Wing shoot ahead of him and into the ion wake of an interceptor. The Gan's first shot struck sparks and armor from the fighter's central ball. One more, Oral, and you have him. 9 and 10, break hard port, get out of there! Oral's compliance with Wedge's order came immediately. His sharp turn took him across Corin's line of flight, forcing Corin to yank back on his stick and roll to starboard. He leveled out and started the turn to port, but Whistler's shrill whine filled the cockpit. The stick slammed back into Corin's chest, pinning him in his ejection chair as the droid brought the X-Wing's nose up. Red crept into the corners of Corin's vision, and the stick's pressure against his breastbone made breathing hard. The vast expanse of the Black Asp's bulk filled his view screen. By all the souls of Alderaan! A blue bolt of ion cannon energy sizzled in and battered down the X-Wing shields. Whistler yowled, and the stick went slack for a moment, allowing Corin to act. He slapped the stick hard to port, bringing the X-Wing up in a snap roll that put the interdictor beneath his feet. He started to pull back on the stick, to show the cruiser his stern and rocket full away from it, but he felt a tingle run through him as another ion blast partially caught the starboard stabilizer foils. The astromech's screams died abruptly, and Corin was slammed against the left side of the cockpit. Even without seeing the stars swirling around him like dust motes in a Tatooine sand tornado, he knew what had happened. The ion blast had knocked out his starboard sublight engines, leaving the pair on the port side of the ship operating at full power and without competition. This put him into a flat spin, with his stern chasing his nose, completely out of control. But at least I'm hard to hit. The ion blast, in addition to shutting Whistler off, had killed all his cockpit electronics and acceleration compensator. The only thing he could do, he knew, was to shut his engines down and go for a restart. Until he had some sort of power, or until that cruiser slaps a tractor beam on me, the X-Wing would spin like a gyroscope. Gotta power down. That was easier said than done. The emergency shutdown panel had been placed on the right side of the cockpit. Mashed against the opposite side by centrifugal force, it remained just beyond the reach of his outstretched fingers. Gritting his teeth, Corin levered himself off the cockpit wall with his left elbow and tried to hit the panel. The stick slammed him back into place, pinning him. Corin caught it with his right hand and tried to pry it forward. Pain radiated out from where the stick had jammed his medallion into breastbone. So much for that being terribly lucky. The stick made it painful to breathe, adding one more unnecessary complication to his predicament. A sense of urgency boiled up in him, overriding panic instead of boosting it. Let me go! He redoubled his effort to move the stick. It resisted at first, but Corin refused to be daunted. Concentrating with every fiber of his being, he pushed and the stick yielded. Centimeter by centimeter, he forced it away from himself. Yes, I'm free. Corin shoved the stick as far as it would go to the left, then used it to pull himself away from the port side of the cockpit. With his left hand on the top of the stick, he brought his elbow up, inch by inch, scraping it past various switches and knobs that had died with the rest of his ship. When his arm came up above the top of the stick, he lunged to the right, letting the stick slip beneath his armpit, and hit the shutdown panel with his right elbow. The thrumming of the port engines died, leaving him alone with the sound of his own breathing in the cockpit. The ship still spun and showed no signs of slowing, but without friction or other resistance in the vacuum of space, it would continue to spin forever. Corin relaxed slightly in relief at cutting the engines off, and was rewarded by being bashed back against the port side of the cockpit. His helmet hit a hard stanchion, leaving him a touch dazed. Along with the spin-induced nausea, it made him hope someone would shoot him and end his misery. That flash of despair lasted for a moment until another spark of pain spread out from his breastbone. Kill us they might, but I'm not going to make it easy for them. He slid his right hand across his chest, past the medallion in his left shoulder, and tipped 3 switches up. A bit farther along, he lifted a plasteel plate that covered a recessed red button, then punched that button and hoped for the best. What he wanted to hear was the return of the engine thrum, but what he got was nothing. Ignition circuits must be fried. There has to be something else I can do. Without the engines, he had no power. The primary power cells and the reserve power cells for the lasers probably had enough energy in them to at least give him communications, attitude control jets, and limited sensors, but getting at it from inside the cockpit presented him a problem. It's not like I could just land this monster and do some manual cross-wiring. Corin laughed aloud. No, but I can manually land this thing. He brought his left leg up and hooked a small tab on the cockpit wall with his heel. It flipped out a small bar that sat in the groove. Corin centered his foot on the bar and pumped it up and down. It came back up beneath his foot, and he pushed it down again and again. From the nose of the fighter, he heard metallic pops and clicks. The bar was connected to a small generator that put out enough current to deploy the fighter's landing gear. Extending them did nothing to affect the spin, but the payoff Corin hoped for wouldn't come until the gear locked into place. With a shudder he felt throughout the ship, the landing gears snapped into their fully deployed positions. The monitor in the cockpit lit up again. and the stick began to feel alive in his left hand. Laughing aloud, Corin took the stick in his right hand and tugged it over to the starboard side of the cockpit. The spin began to slow. He fingered the medallion with his left hand. Because no power landings would be seriously harmful to most life forms, extending the landing gear on the fighter opened a circuit that allowed the primary and reserve power cells to drive the S-foil impeller jets for simple maneuvering and to kick in the repulsor lift drives. The power cell tap tended to be used primarily by techs for moving the ships around in repair and maintenance facilities, because running the fusion engines up to full maneuvering power in enclosed spaces is generally considered harmful to most living creatures. Corin tried his restart again, with the same results as before. Diagnostics told him he'd lost one of the starboard incom phi inverted lateral stabilizers, and the engine just wouldn't start with power levels fluctuating all over the place. No engines, but maybe I have sensors and communications. He brought those systems online, but got nothing from sensors and a lot of static covering voices on the comm. This is Rogue 9. I could use some help here. Waiting for a reply, he flipped on the proton torpedo launch circuits. Without sensors, his ability to hit anything was nil, but at least he could get a shot or two off. And I'm probably going to need it. Above and to starboard, he saw the black asp. Rogue Squadron had regrouped to form a screen between the interdictor and the smuggler. He couldn't tell how many rogues were left, and the occasional glint of sunlight off TIE Interceptor's quadanium solar panels told him a few of the squints still existed, but there seemed to be far more rogues than there were TIEs, and that was a good sign. The interdictor ventured in close to the fight, its lasers and ion cannons blazing away with green and blue bolts. The energy streams filled space with tangles and knots as the gunners tried to target the elusive X-wings. Though he had been hit fairly early, he knew his collision avoidance maneuver had kept him in one place long enough for the gunners to hit him, and that only because he'd ventured far closer to the interdictor than he should have. He half heard a command cackle in over the comm, but he couldn't make sense of it. Out beyond his ship's nose, he saw a series of proton torpedo launches from the X-wings. They came in at the large ship from a multitude of angles. While the power in each of the torpedoes was hardly a threat to the interdictor, the combined damage of a volley like that was enough to batter down its forward shields. The concave energy wall glowed a sickly yellow before it imploded, and Corin thought certain he saw several torpedoes explode against the interdictor's hull. Yeah, rogues! Corin laughed aloud. Oh, Whistler, you're going to be sorry you missed this. The interdictor brought its nose up to pull the vulnerable bow away from its X-wings. It could repair the damaged shield by pumping more energy into it, but that would require the shutting down of the gravity well projectors. That, in turn, would allow the X-wings and the yacht to escape, turning the whole engagement into a draw. If you don't count the vaped squints. The big ship executed the roll that combined with a loop to reverse the cruiser's course. He's running! They've driven it off! Yes! His jubilance died as he realized that meant the cruiser was heading back in his direction, and the surviving TIE interceptors were flying along in its wake like fledgling Minox chasing a slow freighter. Whistler, you're lucky you're not seeing this. It'll be ugly. Rogue 9, do you copy? I copy. Corin didn't immediately recognize the voice. I'm on partial power. Whistler's dead and I'm blinder than a Y-wing. This is Rogue Null. You have squints coming your way. I marked 2. Oh, more good news. Thanks, Null. Be my guest. Corin craned his neck to see where Tycho and the shuttle were, but he couldn't see it. I'm naked here, so please get 'em off me. Not possible, 9. Clear your sensors to 354.3. What? Corin frowned as he saw the TIE getting closer. I'm a sitting hut here. So you've indicated, 9. Clear your sensors. Corin punched the frequency code into the keypad under his left hand. Done, Null. Happy hunting, 9. Corin's targeting display came back alive, and his monitor showed targeting telemetry data from the Forbidden. Beyond the display, Corin saw the TIEs juke to try to shuck the shuttle, but Tycho managed to keep his sights locked on the lead interceptor despite flying a slower, less agile craft. The HUD went red, and Corin hummed in an imitation of Whistler's target tone. He squeezed the trigger on his stick twice, sending 2 torpedoes streaking out at the lead interceptor. Lead's gone, Null. Give me number 2. The display flickered. Then Corin nudged the X-Wing around and launched 2 more missiles at the interceptor boxed in red on his tactical display. So intent had the Imperial pilots been on losing the shuttle behind them, they had no chance to react to the missiles shooting in at them. The first pilot died without being able to execute even the most basic of evasive maneuvers. The proton torpedoes blasted through the cockpit ball, ripping the craft to bits and igniting the ion engine fuel into a swollen ball of fire. The second set of missiles lanced through that fireball and blew one wing off their target. That squint careened away, somersaulting and twisting wildly through space. Bits and pieces of it blew off into the void, then it exploded brilliantly, blotting out the image of the interdictor going to light speed. Great shooting, 9. Corin shook his head. Greater flying, Null. I did the easy part. The kills are yours, Corin. 3 confirmed. The best today. The Corellian pilot shrugged. Maybe today wasn't so unlucky after all. Glad you feel that way, 9. Why, Captain? You had the most kills. When we get where we're going, all the drinks are on you. And that's the end of the chapter. Hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you soon.